Hey everyone, welcome back to another video. In this one, I'm taking a look at Mr. Fantastic, and similar to Quicksilver, I wasn't able to get his potential right away, so I had to wait a bit to actually make the video to test him at tier 4. I did end up getting Invisible Woman to tier 4 and made a video about that, so if you haven't seen that yet, make sure to check it out. It's actually pretty interesting, and in that it also covers some of Mr. Fantastic's performance in Alliance Conquest at level 70. My initial impression of Mr. Fantastic at level 70 was that he just really wasn't that good. His performance in PvE was pretty lackluster, and in PvP he wasn't really tanky enough or did nearly enough damage to justify the fact that he is a native tier 2 and costs so much, and the fact that you also need the epic quest to unlock him. He does become more manageable at level 80, specifically because he can get to level 80 unlike other characters, so he does become better there, but his true potential doesn't really shine unless you can get the character to tier 4, and you'll notice the great improvement that provides not only in PvE, but also things like Timeline and Alliance Conquest, and certain seasons of Otherworld Battle depending on the debuff list. I initially didn't really have a great build on the character. I only had some mythic Urus, I didn't have his artifact, and the CTP that I tested throughout all of the content was a mighty CTP of Conquest. I didn't use a damage proc throughout the PvE testing. However, once I finished testing in Timeline for the Alliance Conquest testing, and for one of the tests in Giant Boss Raid, I did end up equipping a bunch of Odins on him and also getting his artifact, just to see how much better he gets, and also because I thought that his performance in Timeline was better than expected. The first test I did was to take him into a stage 24 of Null without using his leadership or supports, or again without a damage proc, and his performance here was very lackluster. He was barely able to complete this with around 30 seconds left, which is really not that good, especially for a character that is native tier 2, is part of an epic quest, and has a uniform with a kit based in 2024. I wouldn't necessarily recommend building him for PvE. There are better options and even cheaper options that perform just as well, if not better. However, if you do want to build him for this, you can use a CTP of Rage just to make it easy for yourself, but I think in this case, because the character is very proc friendly and doesn't really have a lot of skills that you layer on top of one another in terms of having to miss procs and stuff, I'd probably recommend going with a single skill damage proc like a CTP of Energy or even a CTP of Destruction. Obviously, because the character can get to level 80, that provided a huge improvement for him in World Boss Legend. He was able to clear the same stage about 2 minutes and 30 seconds faster than before. In order to get a better idea of how much of an improvement the tier 4 provides, I also took him into a stage 85, this time using his leadership and a support. Fortunately, there wasn't another support available, so I wasn't actually able to complete the first phase within that 2-minute window to be able to complete the fight entirely. But he was pretty close, and I'm pretty sure that with another support, he would have been able to do so, but regardless, I was short by around 20 seconds. Just to get more perspective, I also took him into a stage 49 of Gore. This time I had access to another support, Taskmaster, so with that I was actually able to complete the stage with around almost 1 minute and 30 seconds left. Similar to Invisible Woman, the tier 4 upgrade for Mr. Fantastic is a massive improvement for him. He gets one of the largest stat bumps that I've seen for a character. He gets almost 45,000 HP increase when he gets to tier 4, and his physical attack increases by well over 30,000. On top of this, similar to Invisible Woman again, the tier 4 skill fills up very quickly, and you can basically have it up almost every rotation, meaning that you not only get 120% attack to the character permanently, but also a ton of healing and damage reduction, not only for PvE, but also, more importantly, for PvP. In terms of the strikers for PvE, you could obviously go with a good one like Thor, but for Mr. Fantastic, Ghost Rider is likely the most ideal, since he not only is good for PvE, but also helps him in PvP, considering that the striker has an iframe ignore. Besides that, other good characters for PvP could be Hulk or Spider-Man, because they also have a very high attack, and potentially an iframe ignore and penetration. And most importantly, all of these characters match his instinct type, allowing him to get the maximum buffs on his tier 4 skill. As you could see from the start of this clip, he was able to complete that first phase 1 minute faster with the tier 4, and complete the fight entirely with about 1 minute and 30 seconds left. The improvement on only the first phase of the Null fight isn't really a clear indication of how much of an improvement he gets with the tier 4, so obviously I also did the Gore fight as a test to see in that comparison, and in this you can see that he was able to get about a 2-minute improvement in his clear time, being able to complete the gore stage with around 3 minutes and 20 seconds left, whereas he previously did it with around 1 minute and 20 seconds left. I do have to mention that although he is much better with the tier 4, his skills are still kind of clunky, and oftentimes when you use the 4th skill, he'll be locked in place and the character can move around to avoid the damage. And similarly, even the ultimate skill or the T3 skill can potentially whiff if he locks in when the skill just starts and the opponent moves after. It takes some time for the character to kind of move around and you do lose a lot of damage, or he could potentially just whiff entirely if the opponent moves far enough. Because Mr. Fantastic has the tags Combat, Hero, Human, Male, he does satisfy restrictions in both ABX and ABL. However, I wouldn't really recommend using him there because there are obviously better options, but more importantly because the main issue he has is that his hit count isn't really that great, which doesn't really help his chain hit either and his overall score. Aside from that, the character doesn't really have the cancel effect for the different seasons outside of paralysis, and you could potentially use a striker to change that, but it could also potentially really reduce your score if you don't use the striker that deals the most damage, but instead provides you with that cancel effect. At level 70, using his leadership, 2 supports, and no damage proc, I was able to score almost 8.5 million, which isn't really that great. With no damage proc, I would ideally want to hit at the very least 9 million if the character was good for this mode. At tier 4, his performance drastically improves by around 2.5 million, and the main reason for that is, like I mentioned, you can fill up that tier 4 skill very quickly, pretty much every rotation, so you not only get the 120% increased attack if you use the right striker to match his instinct type, but you also get the striker coming out every rotation and inflating your hit count drastically. At tier 4, he does become more usable in ABX, but again, you have better options and ones that have all of the cancel effects too, like Hulk for example, Dr. Octopus, even Black Panther. I also took him into ABL just to get a general idea of how he performed there, but again, I could see that he isn't really meant for ABX or ABL since I was only able to score close to 4.5 million there. And if a character was really able to do well in this mode, he should be able to score at least 5 to 6 million without a damage proc, which Mr. Fantastic wasn't able to do. I wasn't really able to get the cleanest tests in Giant Boss Raid because I couldn't fight in the day that he had a type advantage versus the boss, but regardless, you could still see the difference that the tier 4 makes. In the first test, I had a pretty horrible clear time with about 3 minutes and 40 seconds remaining roughly, which again is partly because he doesn't have that type advantage. It probably would have been closer to 4 to 5 minutes, but still for level 70 that isn't really that great. In the second fight, when I was able to get him to tier 4, you can get a much better perspective of how huge of an improvement the tier 4 makes. I was able to complete the same fight 3 minutes faster. I took him into one final test when he did have a type advantage, and later on when I ended up building him fully with all Odins and using his artifact, and that allowed him to clear this stage about 1 minute and 40 seconds faster still, and the fact that he completed it with a little over 8 minutes remaining is more on par with how the character should perform as a baseline, but doesn't really unless you can get him to tier 4. Again, a native tier 2 character shouldn't really be lackluster unless you can get them fully built out. They should have value before you can get them to their final upgrade. In terms of the rotation, you quick cancel the first, second, and third skill, and then delay cancel the 5th skill after you see the laser beam go up in the air, and then go into the 4th skill. When you have your tier 3 available, you effectively use that after the 4th skill, but you want to cancel the 4th skill as quickly as possible so that you can transfer that single skill damage proc onto the tier 3 skill. If you miss that, his damage will fall off considerably. You want to use the tier 4 skill whenever you have it available, since you will basically fill it up almost every rotation. Like I mentioned previously, I was actually quite surprised how Mr. Fantastic did in PvP. I initially tested him at level 70 and he really didn't do well at all. He pretty much ended up dying on every team that I tried him against. His offense was lacking and his survival wasn't really that great. That's why I didn't save any of that footage. But you can see here that in the tests that I did at tier 4, it made a pretty massive difference. The stat bump that he gets not only really helps his offensive capabilities and his counter skill, the 3rd skill, but also that huge HP boost really helps his survival, which in turn also helps him get that tier 4 skill, which increases his healing and survival that way, as well as the damage mitigation that he gets from that. But on top of it, the tier 4 skill can also be filled up very quickly to give him that boost, which, like I mentioned previously in the PvE part, it gives him that 120% attack increase, which further improves his offensive capabilities. And the tier 4 striker comes in very handy because it can take out opponents instantly. What I'm trying to say is that you essentially need the character to be tier 4 for him to be able to compete with some of the top meta characters. If you have him at level 70 or 80, he's going to be largely inconsistent, and you want to really leverage the tier 4 skill with him because it fills up quickly and provides him with many different layers of offensive and defensive capabilities that allow him to tackle metas that he otherwise wouldn't be able to. I do have to warn you though that even if you potentially get the character to tier 4, he isn't the most consistent in PvP. The issue mainly revolves around the fact that his AI rotation isn't the best. It does open with the third skill, which is good because it provides him with that iframe ignore. It gives him a ton of benefits, including 40% penetration to all sources, which honestly could be better, but he also gets the 40% healing, which is quite nice and can be boosted further with recovery rate. The issue with the third skill, however, is that if the counter portion of the skill doesn't go off, the skill essentially is kind of a dud and doesn't really do much. On top of that, he often goes into the fourth skill after, which is nice because it provides him with the 100% increased damage to that skill, but the problem is that it kind of roots him in place. It doesn't provide too much protection because it isn't a full iframe, and the animation is so long that he can basically just be burst down by reflect or the opponent just attacking him once he's doing that fourth skill. The fourth skill does give him invincible, which is good, and the AI basically just sticks between these two skills. It never really uses the fifth skill, which I guess is good because the fifth skill has a pretty long windup and he'll probably just die if he tries to use it, but you don't really get the benefit of the barrier from that fifth skill at all. One of the other issues I noticed is that the third skill area of effect when the counter portion is active seems to be a little weird. If the opponent is very close to him when the counterpart activates, sometimes it'll overshoot the opponent and a bunch of the hits will be lost and they won't take any damage from it. It doesn't happen all the time, but it does seem to happen occasionally. Besides this, he does have some good passives. He has that fracture immunity, meaning that he won't have his healing reduced or his attack reduced from the fracture effect. And he also has the ability to heal when he gets hit for about 5% HP over 2 seconds, which has a 5-second cooldown. So that's good. Even if he gets locked down, he can get some potential healing. And the third skill will give him that active healing very quickly after if he comes out of it. His damage reduction for a native tier 2 is a little bit low. It's 25%, and honestly I think that they could bump it up to 35% without much issue, because they're kind of taking into account the fact that he can get another 40% physical damage reduction to physical damage specifically, which would put him probably around 65 or 75 with that 35%. But even then, I don't think that's really an issue for the character because he would still be balanced considering how his kit functions. Mr. Fantastic does seem to perform pretty well versus physical types because of that passive, especially speed types that he has a type advantage versus, but I found that even versus Wolverine that I thought initially would burst him down very quickly, he does seem to survive that fifth skill burst initially, especially if you have a survival based build, mostly because of that physical damage reduction, but also if you can get that tier 4 skill to go off, it seems like he gets sort of like a pseudo immortal effect that potentially allows you to survive Wolverine's immortal artifact and take him out completely. In terms of the recommended build for the character, I would highly advise going with a survival based build for two main reasons. The first is that he highly depends on the third skill having the counter effect activate to take out the opponents. Most of the times he won't take out opponents with things like the fourth skill or any other skill really, because those are the ones that he focuses. So you kind of want him to survive as long as possible to actually go into the third skill and have the counter portion activate. A damage proc won't really help him as much as you would think, especially considering that he has that immortal artifact, because he can already take out the opponent when the third skill counterpart activates. And by giving him a damage proc, you're not guaranteeing that it'll activate on the third skill. It could activate on the fourth skill, for example, and won't really help him much at all. And on top of that, it'll make his survival worse, so he'll have less chance to go into that third skill counter. The second factor is that you want the character to survive as long as possible, not only to activate that third skill counter, but also to activate his tier 4 skill. The tier 4 skill will make him immensely tankier. It'll give him a bunch of healing that activates passively, as well as that pseudo kind of damage reduction immortality, and give him a further attack increase boost. And the fact that he has a kind of immortal effect with Franklin's artifact means that he has more of a chance to go into that tier 4 skill and potentially wipe out a whole team once he goes into it. In terms of the actual build to give him, I found that the CTP of Conquest was the most ideal option for him. It not only provided him tankiness up front if the opponent tried to take him out quickly before he could activate his counter skill, but oftentimes the top proc would activate just in time before he went into his counter skill, so it allowed him to basically take out the opponent in one skill activation. Aside from that, he not only gains the survival from the wall proc activating, but the healing really does help out his survival because he gets that passive healing when he's hit every so often, and the active healing of 40% that boosts up to basically 80% with the CTP of Conquest, and the recovery rate boost that it provides, which pretty much activates all the time because he spams the third skill so often. You could alternatively also try an Authority and try to stack up that damage reduction even further, but the reason I recommended a Conquest, aside from the benefits that I mentioned, is because he goes into that fourth skill after, which already gives him Invincible, and benefits the Conquest more than the Authority does because you already have Invincible, so activating it again from the CTP won't really help, especially if the opponent penetrates through the Invincible. On top of that, the Authority doesn't really help his survival on the healing aspect like the Conquest does, because it doesn't really affect the recovery that he gets from the passive and active portion. You could argue that in this case a CTP of Regen might be able to tie a CTP of Authority's performance, but I still wouldn't necessarily recommend it because you don't get the Super Guard Break immunity that the Authority provides, and you also don't get the offensive increase that the Authority provides. Besides that, in a 3 vs 3 situation, it's likely that you're going to have at least one other character with that CTP of Regen to provide penetration to your team, possibly on Franklin if you don't use an insight on him. If you want to know how to play the character on manual, you basically just want to cancel the fourth skill initially and go straight into the third skill. That should take out the opponent if the counter activates. After that, when the opponent respawns or the next one comes in, you want to activate the third skill as soon as you can because the opponent will likely attack and you can get the counter off. From there, if you're facing opponents that have revives and immortality, when they come back in, you basically want to open with the fifth skill before going into your third skill, or the 4 cancel into the third skill, so that you get that 10 hit barrier and additional attack on the field. Because you do end up canceling a lot of effects that aren't the third skill, you should be able to get your tier 4 active, which will help with your healing, and potentially also get your tier 3 skill active to take out some very hard to kill opponents, like Wolverine for example. It's obvious that the character is designed to excel in a 3 vs 3 format, since you obviously won't be using Franklin and Mr. Fantastic in Timeline, considering you have to use 2 characters to make one functional. However, in Alliance Conquest, you can obviously pair these characters together, and to be able to show how good Mr. Fantastic is by himself, I obviously didn't include Invisible Woman. In this first test, I wanted to see how he does versus some strong characters that he can benefit from that physical damage immunity. You can obviously see that he was able to defeat characters like Carnage and Gore, despite the fact that they have a revive and immortality. In the second test, I wanted to see how he handles initial burst from characters like Quicksilver and Madeline Pryor that has a type advantage versus him, but also to see if he could survive and just outright beat characters like Madeline and Rachel that have energy damage and that he can't really rely on that physical damage reduction to be able to beat them. As you can see, he was able to survive and take out the first team, and one of the other benefits I found from the character is that oftentimes going into the second team, he'll have his tier 4 ready right away, which will act sort of like an awakening skill does and potentially wipe out the second team fairly quickly. You can see that in this test and the following test that I do after this. Finally, the purpose of the last test is to see how he handles characters that not only have a type advantage versus him, but also have a reflect and iframe ignores in their kit. So he has to deal with characters that have burst damage like Hulk, have counter and iframe ignore skills like Emma and Kang, but also the reflect from Emma. And you can see again that the tier 4 skill and the 3rd skill counter activate almost immediately to wipe out the 2nd team almost instantly. The reflect isn't really a factor versus Mr. Fantastic because he's an iframe when he uses the 3rd skill, and characters like Strife that would potentially counter him having a type advantage don't really benefit from the mass amount of fracture that he provides because Mr. Fantastic has immunity to it. As much as I enjoyed Mr. Fantastic's improvement at tier 4, I still wouldn't recommend him to many players just because he costs so much. You need to get the epic quest, he is a native tier 2 character that you need to build up, and you need to get his uniform, but you also need to get Franklin with his artifact and use him on the team for him to excel in things like Timeline and Alliance Conquest. And you obviously wouldn't use him in Timeline because you need to occupy 2 spots to make one character functional. Besides this, you need to get the character to tier 4 for him to have really any kind of value. He just doesn't really cut it at level 70 or 80. His offense is pretty lackluster and his survival isn't really that good, which is really unfortunate for a native tier 2 character, and it should never really be like that you have to boost them to tier 4 for them to have really any kind of value on your roster. The character is also a little bit clunky even after you get him to tier 4, so I think the devs can probably do some quality of life changes there. I would probably recommend that they increase his damage reduction from 25% to 35%. That would really help with his survival even if you don't have him at tier 4. And on top of that, the one major change that I would give him would be to give him 2 hits that provide 100% damage increase on his 4th skill as opposed to 1 hit. When you do just 1 hit, it makes the character unnecessarily difficult to play in PvE because you have to make sure to cancel that skill, otherwise you lose the damage proc that you're trying to pass. But on top of that, in PvP, if the character's 4th skill gets cancelled, he doesn't really get any benefit on another skill, whereas if it provided 2 skills, if the 1st skill got cancelled, he could potentially pass off the proc to another skill afterwards, which would also improve his offensive capabilities even when he's not at tier 4. With all that said, even though I don't necessarily recommend this character now, there is something to think about for the character in the future. If Franklin gets an upgrade and Mr. Fantastic's performance gets cleaned up a little bit more, he could potentially be a very strong character with Franklin in Timeline, as well as some of the other Fantastic Four characters. Besides this, the devs really should consider upgrading the immortality duration on Franklin's artifact from 2 seconds at the 4th-second artifact to 4 seconds, and then at the 6-star artifact it should go up to about 6 seconds as opposed to 4 seconds. The current duration just doesn't really cut it in the current meta and doesn't really make too much of a significant difference outside them surviving, because they could potentially be locked down and still die after that effect activates. That pretty much does it for this one. I'm not really sure how much I'm going to invest into Thing and Torch. I just can't really see them being that useful on my roster. I was kind of hoping that Thing would be able to provide iframe ignore to the team. That would actually open up some pretty interesting team combinations outside of using Mr. Fantastic with Franklin and Invisible Woman, but I don't really think they're going to do that. Anyways, if you enjoyed this video, found it entertaining or useful, please consider liking so that I know you enjoyed the content, possibly subscribing and sharing it with others. It could help them out, and it definitely helps my channel grow so I can make more videos like this. As always, I appreciate people taking the time to watch my videos, so thank you, but the video's now over.